Ryan, a lot of founders ask, what is the balance between these three things? And answer them in any order that you want. Brand, UX, and design. And we know there are three distinct things. At which point in time do they become important? Not so important? How would you approach each one? I'd love to hear your thoughts.
To me, this would go back to, what is your buyer buying? How are they buying it? How are you delivering? Right? Because you could have the most amazing brand in the world where everybody just seems to love your messaging, love what you talk about, love what you stand for, but you sell a complicated SaaS solution at the same time and your UX sucks. I'm looking at you, LinkedIn advertising. Then, so one can trump the others. I think it depends a lot on what we're selling. I think brand is one of those things that startups worry a lot about at the early stages, but that they worry about the wrong aspects of it. They might be, and they also misconstrue what we mean by those things. I might think that means, just your visual identity, which is not really what your brand is. But early on, you want to think about what's the reach of each of those things? None of those things has any distribution in its own right. So how are we putting those things out there and where can they live? Right. So at a very early stage, it's actually quite easy to develop brand in some ways, because if I just start blogging about a topic that I like, let's just say I'm going to start blogging about all of the crazy stuff I do to try to keep myself physically fit enough to continue playing soccer for as long as I can. I start to blog about it, right? I am beginning to build a brand there. The way I describe what I'm doing, the language that I use becomes really important in that brand building. I would argue at that point, the UX going to be defined by somebody else. I'm blogging on somebody's platform. I'm posting on LinkedIn, wherever, right? It lives somewhere else. So I don't have a whole lot of control over that either. So I think we also want to think about what aspects of this do we have control over. UX doesn't matter at all at this point because I don't even have a product, right? In terms of the balance of those three things, I think that there isn't a standard answer to this. I think it goes back to the thing that I asked first. What are you selling and to who, right? How much do they care? How much does that impact their ability to access the value that you provide? And I don't just mean in terms of usability. If you have a really bad brand and a really good UX, great design, great product, a lot less people are going to know about it. So that impacts their ability to get value from you because you stopped them at the brand level. They're like, Ryan is such a jerk. I don't care how good their product is. I'm never going to use it. Conversely, if they're like, man, I love Ryan. He's hysterical. I would hang out with him all day long. But man, the design is okay, but the UX on this thing that he built to help me track my biohacking stuff is such garbage that I'm torn. I want to turn it off, but I just love him so much. But no, I'm going to cancel my subscription, right? Whatever it is. So it goes back to, again, what are you selling to who? And how much are those three things going to impact that? I would argue that at the really early stages, none of those three matter a ton, because most of those, brand in particular, is going to become far more important as you scale and reach more people because of the impact it starts to have on either attracting or repelling people, right? And brands can do both. That said, your brand can start to live early on. Right? Your brand is as big as the number of people you're talking to, and it's relevant to all of those folks. And so it's not one of those things where I'm saying don't worry about your brand until later. But in terms of startups' hierarchy of needs, I'm not sure I would put those three things near the top for me in terms of all the other things that I would be doing.
What would you be doing?
Where are we with the startup? How far in are we at this point?
Well, give it to me in terms of the range, right? We got founders that are at all different stages looking at it. At what point in time in their journey does something become more important than brand, UX, or design?
Let me do them in order. So I would say brand would become important to me first. And there's a couple points where it would become really important. The importance of them also then gets magnified by some other things that happen. And we could talk about how those things interrelate as well. So brand would be the first one for me. That might just be due to my predilections around marketing. And it just tends to be something that we do more of in marketing. Like brand is extremely important aspect of that, right? Maintaining that brand voice, understanding what the brand vision is, the clarity, all of that stuff is super important. Design is also important, but I got the impression that you were talking more about the product level design or service design than
how pretty it looks.
Communication. Oh, so you were just talking about how pretty it looks. So, yeah. It's funny. Have I ever told you the story of the $150,000 napkin?
No. I can't wait though.
This is the counterexample to how important design and prettiness is. We had been spending a fair amount of money on LinkedIn, and we were running ads on LinkedIn. And I started to wonder what was impacting performance of certain things over others. We had tested different visual styles. We tested, different lead magnets, different hooks, different messaging, lots of stuff. I was scrolling LinkedIn one day, just kind of scrolling and just endlessly scrolling intentionally just to see ads as they came by. And what occurred to me after about half an hour of doing this was that all the content looked exactly the same. The ads looked like the posts, looked like the articles, looked like the announcements. Everything had this sort of polished business feel to it, right? It looked like stock graphic heaven. I thought one of the most important things that we can do in advertising is to break the visual frame, right? We surprise people, we catch them off guard, we catch their attention. I was like, all right, I'm going to try exactly the same messaging as we're running in another article, another ad rather. I'm going to handwrite it on a napkin. So I handwrote the copy on a napkin, and then I immediately wadded up and threw it away because my handwriting is god awful. I went to my wife and I said, "Can you please write this on a napkin?" And she's like, "Why are you writing this on a napkin? Don't ask me questions, please. It's complicated." So my wife wrote the messaging on a napkin, and we went on to run that ad. Right, the results were incredible right out of the gate. It was performing better with exactly the same messaging, same CT. Everything else about the ad was the same, just that visual with that written on it. I got super interested in this, and so I thought, you know what? I am going to test this with my handwriting because I'm going to make it even a little bit uglier. I made it a little bit smaller, a little bit harder to read. It performed even better because people now were like, "What is that? A napkin with words on it?" And then they had to literally lean in to see what it said. I ended up spending, and sorry, so I would have to go back and check now, but I'm sure it was one of our best performing ads ever. One of the highest spends against that specific ad. The last time I checked was around 150,000 just on that single image ad. Design is important, but how pretty it is might not be. In this case, the design was absolutely critical to the success. Gotcha. But it was the opposite of pretty. And so that led me down this path then on LinkedIn in particular. Less polished seemed to work. I started doing screenshots of Excel sheets and just like badly cropped screenshots of PDFs and just things that would break the visual frame long enough for people to see what the heck I was talking about. And then it was incumbent on the copy and the brand and everything else. Design is super important. And it's something that matters to me. But I'm kind of an aesthetics person, so I think that maybe I got to be careful how much of my own bias I'm introducing. But brand, then probably design, but again, fed by brand, and then UX. UX, I think, becomes really important to the point where we actually have a product. So much of what I do with startup companies exists before they even have a product or a service. Where we are just trying to figure out, the customer interview process. How do we see if anybody cares about this? How do we get those first few sales in the door? How do we run this as a service versus a product? How do we MVP this thing to victory? And so I think that skews a bit of my thinking on this, but those really early stages, I think it's important. We get to the point where we need to scale. Obviously, things like UX become really, really important because that's where, we may have, again, early adopters. Early adopters are willing to accept us warts and all, right? They will jump through the flaming hoops. They will fight the tigers that live within our products and our UX and whatever. They'll accept ugly design. They'll accept bad brand communication. When we get beyond that and we want to have more mass market appeal, we want to get into that kind of, slightly lazier middle ground where they may not be as motivated to work with us, then that's where these things start to become more important.
What you've demonstrated for me, it is individual and it's so context dependent. Because I'll just be transparent, I push UX first because I'm at the stage where people are launching MVPs and I'm telling them, listen, if you have an assumption and you need to test whether they're going to push the green button and the button is nowhere to be found, then what is the point? Like, it doesn't matter how good your brand is or how not fancy that button is. If they can't find it, UX is going to be important. That being said, I could tell you stories about founders that raised $3 million just on their brand. They've got a massive brand online, social media. They haven't built anything yet, and they raised their money. UX, obviously important. You reminded me of a founder. They had an IT solution. It was a SaaS. But what they did is their whole staff went and they made cards, letters to potential clients out of construction paper, like they were 5 years old, handwritten, Crayola, this and that, and they mailed them out. And their business exploded and they had all the other stuff going for them, but it was that one design trick
Yeah.
It was pretty but not pretty. That totally took them over the edge. So you're absolutely right. It depends.
It depends on, what does it take to stand out, right? If outstanding UX is going to get you there, I think one of my challenges with UX in particular is that I see a lot of particularly technical founders end up getting caught up in these decisions around this button there versus there versus there. They haven't gone and talked to anybody yet, right? So it's not necessarily UX over brand over design or anything. It's UX at the expense of all else, right? So I hate seeing engineers get stuck on the engineering bench without talking to strangers and finding out if anybody other than their best friend thinks this is a cool idea. We sort of moved from probably most subjective to least subjective. The puzzles and riddles inside UX to me are far more straightforward. We can figure those things out because we can simply just test by moving stuff around. You can do that a little bit with design as well, yes, but it's not just about positioning. It's not just about and everyone is going to be forced into using your interface in the same way, right? Everybody has to use the UX that exists. What we get at the design phase and at the brand phase are reactions, which are not as easily tracked. And so, on one hand, I'm saying that like there's more importance to some of those things in some regard in my mind. There's also less objectivity. And so at the early stages, we don't want to spend too much time on them either. I think the big question within any of these three things is what is enough of any of those? Maybe it's not even the balance for me. How much is enough? How much branding do I need to have done between like 0 and first customer? How much branding do I need to have done between, customer 1 and 1,000, between series seed and series A, if you want to use funding, pre-revenue and post-revenue? How much design? Same question. How much interface? Same question. And I think to your point, it goes back. It's really individual. And it really depends on, again, how much are those related to the current business objectives? If we have a cool solution that once people try, they're going to love, they'll probably excuse us some UX issues if it still gets the job done, right? If the UX is getting in the way of getting the job done, problem. If it's not a problem. It might not be fully optimized, but whatever is at the startup stage. If that same company doesn't have good distribution, their brand isn't out there, people don't know about them, they can't find them, or when they see them, they're repulsed by it for some reason, then it doesn't matter how good their solution is, right? So I think you got to think through, you got to do the calculus on what's the rate limiting factor for our next goal. If our next goal is to onboard 1,000 users, what's going to help us onboard 1,000 users more? Increased UX, better design, better branding. And I'm not saying that there's a straight answer that you have to do the calculus on it company by company. Said differently, or just a different example, we now want to improve our retention and we want to go from 8% churn to 2% churn. Let's look. But again, there's not a straight answer here either, but we can then think about what of those three dials is the most important one to put our hands on. If it's people complaining about usability, it's probably UX. Design might not be as important here. Brand certainly could be. If people just don't if you're over communicating as a brand or under communicating as a brand, or you're not responsive as a brand, that could impact your retention, right? Are you known as a brand who has a really cool product and the worst customer service in the world? Almost named another example there. I'll leave that one aside for now.